Today's story is about a boy whose father locks his own son in animal cages to make him suffer. His food and water were taken away, and he was tortured every day. This cruel father told his son that living in this cage was a punishment for his sins. But the truth was that he was showing his cruelty to his child in the name of God. Now, the question is, will this child manage to escape from his cruel father? To find out the full story, keep watching. This is a psychological mystery thriller movie named Dogman. In the beginning of this story, we meet a man named Douglas, who is caught by the police while smuggling a large number of dogs. Douglas had many injuries, as if he had been beaten up by a gang of goons. Douglas is interrogated by the police, but the truth of the situation is beyond their understanding, so the case is transferred to Dr. Evelyn, a psychiatrist. Dr. Evelyn meets Douglas and asks him where he was taking all these dogs. Douglas replies that these dogs are his family. Wherever he goes, they follow him. Even if he doesn't want them around, they always stay by his side. Evelyn wants to understand how he ended up in this situation, and Douglas knows that if he reveals too much, people will think he's crazy, so he starts telling his story from his childhood. He explains that his father was a cruel man. When Douglas was 9 years old, he saw his father forcing his pet dogs to fight each other. His father kept these animals hungry for days to make them fight, simply for his own amusement. This was his way of asserting control. Douglas's brother was just like his father, showing no humanity, but Douglas was different. He felt a connection with the dogs, and the dogs loved him in return. One day, Douglas secretly fed one of the dogs that his father had kept hungry for days. His father couldn't understand why the dogs weren't fighting, but Douglas was quietly feeding them. However, this act didn't last long, as his brother saw him feeding the dogs and told their father. That night, during dinner, Douglas's father asked him if he had been feeding the dogs, and terrified, Douglas confessed. As a result, his father locked him in the same cages as the animals. And they say that these animals are his family, and the cage is his home. This man, in his frustration at not finding any entertainment, took it out on the tears of a 9-year-old child. From that moment on, his daily torment became a source of twisted pleasure. Douglas's mother wanted to save her son, but she was powerless. One day, Douglas noticed that she had left their home and run away. Douglas tells Evelyn that he never saw a school building, and that the only reading material in his cage were some magazines. From them, he taught himself to read and write. Evelyn is shocked to learn that Douglas had lived in that cage for so many years that he couldn't even remember how many. His mother's departure was blamed by his father on Douglas, and now his situation was getting even worse. Douglas's brother tells him, "You are a lost soul of God, just pray, because the punishment for your sins is death." Evelyn asks him, "If they kept you locked up like that, how did you get out of the cage?" Douglas explains that one day, a mother dog gave birth to puppies. He protected them from his father and brothers, but one day, his brother saw the puppies drinking their mother's milk and did the same thing he always did, he told their father. His father wanted to kill the puppies, but Douglas stepped in to protect them. The man had a gun, and despite repeated warnings from Douglas to stop, he aimed the gun at him. In the ensuing struggle, Douglas was shot in the hand, and one of his fingers was severed. Wounded and lying on the ground, instead of helping him, his brother prayed to God for forgiveness for his sins and left him with a handkerchief. After spending so many years with these animals, Douglas had learned to communicate with them. He showed a picture of a police car to one of the dogs and instructed it to take his severed finger to the authorities and bring them there. Using their intelligence, the dogs managed to lead the police to the location. Once the police arrived, they immediately called an ambulance and rescued Douglas from the cage. His father and brother were arrested by the police. Douglas tells Evelyn that the day he was rescued was the best day of his life. However, it would have been even better if a fragment of the bullet had hit his spine, as it would have ended his suffering. Because of the bullet injury, he was left physically disabled for the rest of his life. The doctors informed him that his bone marrow was slowly deteriorating, meaning that compared to an average person, he would live a much shorter life. For the heinous crimes committed by Douglas's cruel father, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison, while his brother was given 12 years. The man who locked others in cages couldn't bear the idea of being imprisoned himself, and within 2 years, he took his own life. As for Douglas's brother, despite the 12-year sentence, he was granted a 4-year reduction for good behavior and was released in 8 years. However, his happiness didn't last long because the pale dogs, those same dogs with whom he had been locked in captivity, attacked him as soon as they were let out of their cages. His brother met a painful death, perhaps one he deserved. Evelyn, still trying to understand what had led to Douglas's situation, asks, "Who was the one you were running from that night?" At this point, the story shifts back to a flashback. In this flashback, we see a girl meeting Douglas. The girl tells him about a new gangster in town. This gangster had begun extorting money from the weak and helpless. At first, they didn't mind giving him the money, but now the extortion amount was increasing every week. Out of fear, Douglas's aunt had to sell some of her old belongings just to pay the weekly demand. But now, they had no money left for the next week, and if they didn't pay, the gangster's men would harm them. Douglas reassures the girl, saying, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." The next day, we see the extortion mafia, and Douglas decides to teach the gangster a harsh lesson. On his signal, one of his dogs grabs the mafia boss's phone in its mouth and, followed by another dog, brings it to the boss's table. The second dog, with strong jaws and sharp teeth, places the phone on the table and tells the boss to speak to Douglas. When the boss picks up the phone, one of the dogs bites his private parts, sending a clear message. In this way, Douglas got the gangster right where he wanted him. Douglas tells the mafia boss that he can extort money from anyone else, but not from the laundromat woman. He demands that the boss agree to this deal, and if he refuses, his dog will bite his private parts. Terrified, the mafia boss accepts the offer, agreeing that his men will no longer bother the woman. After this, Douglas's dog spares the boss's life. While Douglas taught the mafia boss a lesson, he also made a new enemy. Evelyn asks him if, after being rescued, he was sent to a care home where he made any friends. Douglas replies that he was transferred from one cage to another. In the care home, there were other children like him, but they were all afraid, broken by life, unable to come together. They were only focused on surviving. Evelyn asks if he had ever fallen in love in all those years. At first, Douglas denies it, but then he admits that there was a girl named Salma, who was much older than him. Salma taught him how to apply makeup and would read Shakespeare's stories to him. He felt alive with her, and for the first time, he became the person he wanted to be. Douglas never expressed his love for her, though, because one day, she left. Salma was a talented actress, and thanks to her skills, she started receiving film offers. Douglas cherished every article written about her. He completed his education, and the only thing he wanted was to meet Salma one more time and express his feelings. He bought an expensive ticket to see her performance. Sitting in the crowd, he clapped loudly after the show, but feeling too shy to stand up, he got lost in the crowd. A bodyguard told Salma that a big fan wanted to meet her. When Salma saw him, she immediately recognized Douglas. She was genuinely happy to see him, and he gave her a book that he had made for her with his own hands. Before he could say anything else, another man arrives to meet Salma, and it turns out he is her fiancé, and she is going to be the mother of his child. Seeing her with someone else broke Douglas's heart. It was then that he realized that people could only feel pity for him, but no one could love him like that. Douglas was furious that day, feeling inferior and questioning why someone as beautiful and successful as Salma would ever love a man like him. In his anger, he tried to rise from his wheelchair and began shouting. His pale dogs, sensing his distress, came out of their cages and gathered around him, offering their silent support. That moment made Douglas realize that in this world, apart from his animals, no one loved him. From that day on, he became a completely different person, detached from the world around him. The next day, Douglas learned that due to a lack of funds, his dog shelter was being torn down by government officials, who forbade him from stopping the demolition. But the orders came from above, leaving Douglas with no choice but to take the dogs and flee. He took them to an abandoned building, which would become their new home. After that day, he never saw Salma again. She had 2 children and had given up acting, which Douglas saw as perhaps the biggest mistake of her life. In the years that followed, her husband became an alcoholic, and Salma's acting career and stardom faded. Meanwhile, Douglas struggled to find work. His disability and lack of resources made it difficult for anyone to hire him. He soon realized that when it came to money, no one shows sympathy, no matter how much you suffer. One day, while wandering in search of a job, Douglas stumbles upon an LGBTQ community event. It was a place where people performed on stage, and some men dressed in makeup to sing like women. Thanks to Salma's past influence, he had experience performing on stage, and he wasn't bothered by dressing up like a woman. The showrunner, however, told him that the audience was there for entertainment and didn't want to see someone like him on stage. Determined, Douglas stood up in front of everyone and showed the showrunner that he could perform. Seeing his courage, the girls in the audience pleaded for him to be given a chance. Douglas was prepared with his makeup, and when he went on stage, he told the girls, "I can't stand for too long. When my legs start to shake, please help me." As soon as he began singing, the crowd went wild. He sang so beautifully that the showrunner was moved to tears. By the end of the performance, Douglas was exhausted, but he had won everyone's hearts. From that day forward, he started performing regularly on Fridays, and his unique performances became his identity. His dogs, who followed him everywhere, made sure to always listen to him, and together they formed an inseparable bond. Douglas' life continued its downward spiral as his dogs began stealing from homes in the city. They would break into wealthy houses at night, stealing valuables. As a result, there was a rise in thefts across town, and the police launched an investigation. During their search, they came across CCTV footage that showed Douglas at various crime scenes. The officer's suspicion was further confirmed when he saw Douglas wearing the stolen jewelry while performing on stage. The officer approached him and demanded a share of the stolen goods. However, Douglas, uninterested in money, gave him everything. But the officer mocked him, calling him crazy before leaving. Douglas, undeterred, confessed to Evelyn that he had killed a police officer, showing that he had no fear of the law. He admitted that he never intended to kill anyone, but the situation had spiraled out of control. He recounted how the mafia boss, who had once wanted to destroy him, came after him one night. The boss had tracked him down to his home, and, as expected, chaos followed. The mafia boss killed a woman in Douglas' house before targeting him. Douglas, in an attempt to protect himself, ordered his dogs to hide, and a violent battle broke out between the two sides. Despite Douglas' attempts to defend himself, the mafia boss attacked with a machine gun, injuring him. But just as he was about to finish Douglas off, his ammunition ran out. Douglas sarcastically commented that it seemed even his enemy's God had abandoned him. Taking advantage of the situation, his dogs attacked the mafia boss, killing him. Within minutes, the police arrived at the scene. The authorities, having found multiple murders and only Douglas alive, arrested him for questioning. He knew that once he was gone, no one would care for his family. As he had done countless times before, Douglas tried to escape with his dogs, but this time, fate caught up with him. He was captured and brought in for interrogation. Sitting with Evelyn, he revealed the entire story of his life, from beginning to end. Evelyn, moved by his confession, asked why he had shared everything with her. Douglas replied that the one thing they both had in common was pain. He knew that Evelyn, too, had experienced suffering in her life, and that understanding connected them. The movie reaches its heart-wrenching conclusion as Douglas, after confessing to all his wrongdoings and sins, finds himself standing before God in a church. His body and mind broken, he falls to the ground, his loyal dogs surrounding him from all sides, symbolizing the only true love and loyalty he had ever known. In his final moments, Douglas believes that perhaps in his death, he will finally find peace from the endless pain he had endured throughout his life. Meanwhile, Evelyn, dealing with her own torment at home, had been suffering at the hands of her abusive ex-husband. However, with Douglas passing, her life takes a new turn. Her beloved dog, which had once stood by Douglas, now watches over Evelyn and her daughter, ensuring their safety just as Douglas had done for him. The film ends on a bittersweet note, with the sense that although justice for Douglas came too late, his sacrifice was not in vain. His dogs, the only family he ever truly had, continue to protect those he cared about even after his death. Evelyn is left with a sense of both loss and hope, as she knows that she is no longer alone, with Douglas' legacy living on through his loyal companions. The movie concludes, leaving the audience to reflect on the themes of love, loyalty, pain, and redemption. It's a story of survival and the search for human connection, even when the world around you seems devoid of it.